Hello, welcome to this No Cold War Britain podcast on how to end the war in Ukraine. There have been dramatic events on this in recent days, so an aim of this discussion is to look at the causes of the war that must be resolved to bring it to an end, to examine the recent events and to look at the responsibilities of those on this in Europe and this country to bring peace. There'll be four people discussing today. I'm John Ross. I'm a member of the International No Cold War Campaign Collective and a senior fellow of the Chonyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. I'm going to be the moderator of the discussion. The second speaker is Helen Mercer. Helen is a retired teacher and lecturer. She particularly campaigns against privatization and dismantling of the National Health Service. The third speaker is Biljana Vankovska. She is a university professor of international relations and peace studies from Macedonia, a member of the International No Cold War Collective, and a board member of Sweden's Transnational Foundation for Peace Research. The fourth speaker is Sandy McBurney, who is a Labour law solicitor and a long-term communist activist in Glasgow. We're going to start by each speaking having 8 minutes to spell out their views, and I'm going to start. Other speakers today are going to deal with the immediate situation in Ukraine war. I would therefore like to look at the fundamental underlying issues that must be dealt with to end the war. These are not recent views. From 1992 to 2000, I lived in Moscow. Already then, for reasons that will be explained, I stated that provocative actions of NATO would create, for deep historical reasons, a war in Ukraine. One of the subsidiary reasons that sections of the peace movement in the West failed to understand the war when it broke out was that they had not studied the history of the Ukrainian state and blithely talked of the Ukraine without understanding the real historical situation of that state. Turning to the most recent events, new statements by Trump and US Defense Secretary Hegseth about ending the Ukraine war, if adhered to, would address one of the two crucial issues at the war's root, ruling out Ukraine's NATO membership. I say if adhered to because Hegseth tried to talk them back a bit, but Trump must know if Ukrainian membership of NATO is not ruled out, the war will not end. So for the sake of what follows, I will assume that Ukraine's NATO membership is excluded. If NATO had taken this stance before February 2022, war would have been avoided and hundreds of thousands of lives saved. However, NATO's refusal to clarify its position led to two issues becoming intertwined: NATO membership and the national question within the Ukrainian state. Grasping the Ukraine, as established in 1991, was a binational state is fundamental to understanding the situation. Those who have studied Ukraine's history know this. Borders resembling post-1991 Ukraine emerged only after World Wars I and II. Before that, the area was divided between a Russian-speaking east, part of Russia, and a Ukrainian-speaking west, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Poland at different times. Crimea, part of Russia since 1783, was administratively transferred to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954, a change that was insignificant within the centralized USSR. Due to this history, East and West Ukraine were divided by language, religion, and history. There is therefore a national question within Ukraine, with nearly 30% of the population being Russian-speaking, as found by the 2001 census, primarily in the east and southeast, and a Ukrainian-speaking majority in the west. It is possible to maintain unity in bilingual binational states. Belgium is an example of such a small state in Europe, and Canada is a large one in North America. However, acknowledging the national democratic and linguistic rights of the large minority is a precondition to maintain their unity. In Canada, unity is maintained through strict bilingual policies, where all signage, legal systems, commercial transactions, and government operations are bilingual, even where there are no English or French speakers in a particular region. Despite this, Canadian unity has only been narrowly upheld in two referendums, with Quebec voting against independence by only 45,000 votes in the 1995 one, with only 50.6% against independence. Without a bilingual policy, or if there had been discrimination against the French-speaking population, or policies adopted unacceptable to them, Quebec would have voted for independence. In Ukraine, until 2014, there was no serious movement to split the state, as the language and other rights of the large Russian minority were guaranteed, and no fundamentally unacceptable policy was pursued. However, after the 2014 overthrow of the elected Yanukovych government, the Kiev administration pursued policies to eliminate Russian language rights and use military terror against the Russian-speaking population in East Ukraine, including the May 2014 Odessa massacre and prolonged shelling in the Donetsk region. The Council of Europe's Venice Commission, which cannot be accused of pro-Russian, noted that, and I quote, "The current law on national minorities is far from providing adequate guarantees for the protection of minorities. Many other provisions which restrict the use of minority languages have already been enforced since 16 July 2019. Such policies inevitably destroyed the unity of the bilingual, binational Ukrainian state." NATO membership intersected with Ukraine's linguistic national division. Russia repeatedly stated that Ukraine's NATO membership was a red line. The US should understand why. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, it refused to accept Soviet missiles in Cuba and was willing to go to any length, if necessary, nuclear war, to prevent it. The distance from Havana to Washington is 1,100 miles, 1,800 kilometers, only a few minutes flight time for a missile, making defense impossible. But Kiev to Moscow is only 470 miles, 750 kilometers, less than half the distance from Havana to Washington. Ukraine is also a traditional route for conventional military attacks on Russia, seen in the 1941 Nazi invasion and 1942 campaign culminating in the Battle of Stalingrad. The US therefore demanded that Russia accept military conditions which the US made clear it would use any means, including war, to stop if applied to itself. This policy of NATO membership of Ukraine was obviously not supported by the Russian speaking population in Ukraine. NATO's eastern expansion violated US promises to Russia during the German reunification that NATO would not expand an inch eastwards. Numerous US experts on Eastern Europe warned against NATO expansion, particularly into Ukraine. Most famously, George Kennan, the original architect of US Cold War policy, predicted in 1997 that, and again I quote, "Expanding NATO membership would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era." Kennan's prediction was unfortunately regarding Europe turned out to be tragically true. However, US administrations ignored these warnings, insisted on eastward NATO expansion. These overlapping issues, Ukraine's NATO membership and the rights of the large Russian-speaking minority, created the crisis. Regarding the internal situation in Ukraine, it could in theory either be resolved by ensuring full linguistic and other rights for the Russian-speaking minority within the old Ukrainian state's borders, but which Kiev refused after 2014, or the breakup of the Ukrainian state. The latter partially occurred in 2014, leading to localized warfare in Donbass. Angela Merkel admitted that the West never intended to implement the 2014-2015 Minsk agreements, leading to full-scale war in 2022, with the Russian military, with the war following basically the linguistic national divide within Ukraine. Following this post-2014 experience with the Kiev regime, which broke up the binational character of the state and created the war, in practical terms, it's clear that the Russian-speaking population in the east of Ukraine will not anymore agree to remain within the Ukrainian state. To end the war, two issues must therefore be resolved. No NATO enlargement into Ukraine, as agreed by Trump-Hexeth, which the US must be held to. Second, recognition of minority language rights across Ukraine, and because this is by far the largest issue, in particular the Russian-speaking minority in East and Southeast Ukraine. This includes the right of self-determination of the Russian-speaking minority regarding whether they any longer wish to remain within the Ukrainian state as created in 1991. The peace negotiations will only be successful if both issues are settled. Thank you very much, and I'd like to now to hand over to Helen for the next talk or next discussion. Thank you. Helen.
Thank you very much, John. I'm talking about the British dimension of the Ukraine war, and the outstanding feature of that is Britain's intensely bellicose attitude towards Russia. And I think connected with that is the quiescence of the left, of the peace movement in Britain, to what is a quite unnecessary loss of human life, and is the main confrontation in Europe since 1945. Now, Britain overall has committed just shy of £13 billion in military and non-military support to Ukraine, with £3 billion more every year, promised apparently until the crack of doom. It has trained over 50,000 Ukrainian military personnel and delivered long-range weapons which have been used on targets inside Russia. Now, that commitment by the government is backed by the British public if we take opinion polls as any reliable measure. According to an Ipsos poll, at the end of last year, 54% of the population supported the war, a slight drop since 2022, but still a clear majority. If we compare feeling in Britain with that in the United States, Germany, and other countries, Britain is the most firmly supportive of sanctions. It opposes any loss of Ukrainian territory, and in general terms, it's the most hostile towards Russia and specifically towards Putin. And the Russophobia, which I would call that, is such that people think they can say things about Russians, which if they were said about any other national group or ethnic group, would be rightly condemned as racism. So why is this? The mainstream media clearly feeds this attitude, but hostility to Russia has a very, very deep roots in Britain, stretching back to the late 18th century and the Great Game of the 19th century, and a host of tensions between Britain and Russia. As the image developed 200 years ago persists under totally changed circumstances. So Russia then was portrayed as backward and brutal, its leaders were autocratic, and its population was servile and mindless. After the Bolshevik Revolution and during the Cold War, views of Russia simply overlaid those pre-existing images onto the socialist system. Now, during the heyday of the empire, this hostility between Britain and Russia made sense in terms of Britain's imperial objectives, its desire to dominate India, Afghanistan, and the Mediterranean, etc. After the Second World War, Britain was fearful of being marginalised as the two remaining big superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, were seeming to decide matters between them. And I think that anti-Sovietism was used, especially by Churchill and Ernie Bevin, to preserve Britain's relationship with the US as Britain's actual political and economic power declined. But all of those images, all of that situation has now changed. The Raj is long gone. Britain's territorial interests as they existed in the 19th century and caused so many tensions no longer exist. Britain does not rule the waves, and Russia is not socialist. It's a modern and scientifically advanced capitalist country. So the reasons are persisting, the phobia is persisting beyond a real reality. But I think that one reason why the British public in particular has remained committed to an anti-Russian fervour and to the current war is because, like other European populations, it has been protected against the economic consequences of the war, specifically the sanctions as regards Russian energy, etc. In late 2022, the IMF calculated that Britain was one of the worst affected by the huge hikes in energy prices in 2022, which had both direct and indirect effects, raising the cost of living in Britain by 10%. Fearing public reactions to the energy prices, the government introduced a range of measures in 2022, most of them actually effectively compensating the energy companies. Now, one official estimate, and the situation is complicated, but one official estimate gives the total cost of all energy subsidies over the 2 years, 2022 and 2023, and into 2024, as £60 billion. Now, this is 5 times the cost of the so-called benefit fraud, which we hear a lot about, but we hear much, much less about energy subsidies. And the rise in the cost of natural gas affected the price of fertilizers, so costs to farmers rose by 39%, raising prices and threatening future production levels. Energy prices have since declined, but average energy prices in 2024-25 remain 67% above those of the winter of 20 to 2021. And what we're faced in Britain is a situation where 16% of the population, or 8 million people, live in cold, damp houses with all the attendant health effects. This adds to the pressure on the NHS. The increasing privatisation of the NHS means that funds are diverted into public-private profit, and the whole organisation is being fragmented and is increasingly dysfunctional. So energy prices, as a result of the Ukraine war, interact with the structural changes and other developments in the British economy. We have low pay, high unemployment, precarious jobs, expensive housing, together with austerity, the hollowing out of the public sector, and the removal of a host of social safety nets. And it's no surprise that, again, compared with other countries, opinion polls show Britain to be the most worried about economic problems. So just touching on the new situation as it's emerged over the past few days, I think the persistence of undying hostility to Russia now threatens a path to peace. As America seems to back off from Ukraine, European governments are becoming more hawkish, and Britain is part of this, or seems to be for the moment. Yet the interest of the British population, I would argue, must lie in a decrease in tensions with Russia, forging harmonious relations, and including economic relations. No matter what people may think of its system, if we can get on with Saudi Arabia, we can surely get on with Russia. Already, many people are asking how come billions can be found behind the back of the sofa for Ukraine, but the NHS must live within its means. And we have to ask, how will the British public react to increased defence spending? I think that the job must be, and particularly the job may be of the No Cold War Britain, to get the left and the peace movement perhaps to question their own attitudes towards Russia. It must highlight the cost of the war to Britain. And I think by doing that and through that, the peace movement can cut through all the propaganda and in this new situation which is developing may help, hopefully, to beat a path to peace.
Thank you very much, Helen. Right, okay, over to you, Biljana.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be here at this debate on such an important issue. As you know, I'm coming from a region, from the territory of former Yugoslavia, that knows very well what war brings, what war leaves behind, and how hard it is to come to a certain peace plan and how to go through a post-conflict reconstruction, rehabilitation of society, what deep scars all these events leave. So the empathy and the understanding that this Ukrainian war was the most predictable and the most avoidable one really made many of us here frustrated, because we knew what would happen and how hard it would be to stop the war. Until recently, until this dramatic announcement about the phone talk between Trump and Putin, many of us who spoke about peace plan, about peace by peaceful means, which is the principal foundation of the UN Charter, we were all blacklisted, we were cancelled, we were called Putinist or worse. So now the only clear advantage from this peace plan that is somewhere in the cloud may give us at least an open platform to join this debate from our perspective, to argue and to advocate peace solution. Honestly, I'm not sure that President Trump knows how complex is the Ukrainian conflict, and the team around him doesn't promise peace-loving or experts in conflict resolution team that would really handle this situation in a careful way. The very announcement of the phone talk actually made such an upheaval in the powers of, in the corners of power in the European countries that is shocking. Now we see that Europe has become so much militant, more militant than before. And actually, the main opposition to this idea of a peace plan comes directly from NATO member countries, and even from European Union. For example, Kaja Kallas until recently argued that she would never talk to Putin because he is a war criminal. And of course, she didn't mind to talk to Netanyahu, Biden, or whoever else. So at this point, we do not know much about the so-called peace plan, or how it is going to move on stage by stage. It is to expect more casualties, more provocations, and even actions that go toward what I call peace prevention. There will be actions like, for example, the false flag attack on Chernobyl, or God knows what else, things that would try to portray the Russian side as the one who sabotaged the whole process. We don't know how this is going to be handled. We don't know the themes or the stage, the phases of this process. We know that at some certain point of time, Trump is going to meet Putin, probably in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere. But it means nothing, because when two people shake hands or say nice things to each other, there is still a lot of work behind. And honestly, I'm not very trustful in President Trump, who looks sometimes like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the character from a novel and a movie that we remember. Because at the same time, it is a person who would easily acknowledge genocide and move 2 million Palestinians away from their homeland. And on the other side, he wants to get a Nobel Peace Prize, to present himself as a peace dealer, as an empathetic person who cares about human life and loss. So I'm very cautious about trusting, and he changes his positions day by day. The same impression I got from his new defense secretary during the recent NATO ministerial summit. And there are contradictions between the official narratives that explain the phone talk, this famous phone talk, when they come from the White House and the other from Kremlin. I'm sure that Mr. Putin knows what are his red lines, what are his demands, and I think he is quite more consistent. I'm not saying right or wrong, but he is consistent. He knows, and that is the same Russian policy since Munich conference in 2007. He warned about all this that's going on right now. So the real peace plan, as I would like to see it, should take place within the framework of the United Nations. It is very strange that we are discussing some elements and trying to detect what is between the lines of these talks and statements, but nobody even mentioned the United Nations. These two powers, United States and Russia, that are parties in the conflict, because United States actually, even I have a feeling that President Trump is trying to cover up the defeat of NATO and his own army by spelling out a peace idea, peace plan. So this is a second defeat after Afghanistan, actually. So don't get fooled by the rhetoric. Anyway, if they are honest people, they want peace, they should try to talk with their partners in the Security Council, with the 5 permanent members primarily, to persuade them that they are really determined to go through this peace process and take care, of course, of sort of a just peace for both sides, Ukrainians, what is left of Ukraine actually, and the part that already belongs to Russia, the reality on the ground. That is the only way. It will be a credible process that will take place and take care actually of humanitarian aspects, disarmament, demining, providing housing, infrastructure, and everything that is necessary. At this point, the transactional Donald Trump is actually trying to grab, to profit from the last bits that are remaining in Ukraine, their natural resources. That's really doesn't sound like a peace-loving person and humanitarian one who would take care of the people on the ground. And really, I would not like to be in the shoes of the Ukrainians. They probably feel so misused, and I'm not blaming the population, to be clear. Zelensky was a clown. He was the puppet of this military industrial complex. Let's be compassionate with the Ukrainian people as well, because they're not to be blamed for the stupid role and politics of their leader. And they are supporters from the West. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Biljana. Okay, right, over to Sandy. Right, go ahead.
Firstly, it's good news that peace talks are beginning. Why now? In essence, Trump has recognised that NATO has failed in its attempt to use Ukraine as a battering ram to weaken Russia and bring about regime change in Moscow. What caused the war? The world imperialist hegemon, the USA, is in economic decline and deeply in debt, and this is at the root of its aggressive foreign policy. Its political leadership, both Republican and Democrat, seek to maintain the American empire and the status of the dollar as the world reserve currency. To this end, it uses threats, sanctions, and its military might to enforce its dominance. It also attempts regime change operations to remove governments not under its direct control, such as in Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Belarus, etc. Its ultimate aim is to try to combat the rise of China and the development of a multipolar world where the USA will simply be another nation and the dollar just another currency. It's worth reading the RAND report entitled Extending Russia, published in 2019 and available on the internet, where various plans are outlined on how to use US power to weaken Russia and provoke regime change in Moscow. An example of CIA-funded regime change was the Maidan coup of 2014 in Kiev. The far-right government installed was in effect chosen by the USA. Now, what about UK involvement in the war? A former UK ambassador to Moscow, Tony Brenton, described the UK as the most aggressive NATO state vis-à-vis Russia and the war in Ukraine. The UK in the spring of 2022 helped quash the Istanbul peace agreement, which had been negotiated by Putin and Zelensky, by advising Zelensky to reject it and fight on with full NATO support. Since then, it's estimated that over 1 million Ukrainian soldiers have died as a result of the war, and many more have been badly injured and disabled. So far, according to government figures, £16.6 billion have been given by the UK to the Zelensky government in military and economic support. Sanctions against Russia have denied the people of Europe access to cheap fuel, from Russia, and we've also got the blowing up of the North Stream pipeline, which is strongly suggested by the USA, and which also caused an ecological disaster in the North Sea. The British people have never been told that Storm Shadow missiles supplied by Britain to Ukraine, launched from Ukraine against Russia, have to be programmed by British military personnel inside Ukraine, or that last year Russia threatened retaliation against British assets anywhere in the world. In other words, that would be a huge step towards a possible global war. On the 15th of November last year, investigative website The Grey Zone revealed plans by Project Alchemy, a British military and intelligence group set up in February 2022 to prolong the Ukraine war at all costs. The unit's aim was to trigger a palace coup in Moscow. Its plans included cyber attacks, terrorism, and attempts to dismantle independent media outlets using legal harassment and online censorship, such as the Grey Zone. The group also highlighted the danger of the new BRICS trading currency, or the potential for that, and the threat to domestic UK public support for the Ukraine war due to higher prices caused by the war and the sanctions on Russia. So what has the response of the left been? Practically the whole British establishment has backed the war, unlike, say, the Iraq war, and the mainstream media is firmly pro-war. Anti-democratic moves like the banning of RT has caused minimal protests. What remains of the Labour left have been silent on the matter, or worse. See John McDonnell's chairmanship of the Ukrainian Solidarity Campaign, which calls for more weapons for Zelensky and the war. Despite this, there's no enthusiasm for the war amongst ordinary people, but little organised opposition, unlike the massed opposition there is to the imperialist Zionist attack on the Palestinian people. The Labour government has been no different from the Tories, fully supporting and funding the war. The main peace organisation, Stop the War, has been poor on the Ukrainian war, and in fact initially organised demonstrations calling for Russian troops out now. This has changed over the nearly 3 years of the war, and Stop the War is now moving towards opposition to UK involvement in the war, but still doing very little on the matter. Important sections of the trade union movement have supported the war, and there is a real need for socialists and peace activists to work within the unions to win them towards active opposition to the war and towards redirecting the billions being spent in the war towards useful expenditure on social welfare and economic development. We need to organise a mass movement to demand a just and democratic peace in Ukraine and no more UK money or weapons for the war. We need to stop the US drive towards World War III, which will not end with any peace deal in Ukraine. It's obvious that Trump will be looking around at other ways to try and isolate and defeat the rise of China, and that provokes the possibility of further wars. And obviously we've also got the situation in the Middle East, where Trump is fully backing the genocide of the Palestinian people. So it's important for socialists to fight against the imperialist drive towards World War III. And I would also say it's important for socialists to take up the issue of the suppression of democratic rights within Ukraine itself. The 12 left organisations have been banned, and many socialist or communist activists have been jailed in Ukraine under terrible conditions. There is also a resistance movement against conscription, which tries to stop the slaughter of Ukrainian youth in this terrible war. So I think it's very important that even if we get peace in Ukraine, which would good, a democratic and just peace, we realise that in fact the drive towards World War III is still inherent in the system, and we have to try and build a movement to build peace between nations. Thank you.
Okay, great. What I want to do now is just give everybody 2 minutes to come back, to comment on what anybody else said or to raise any new point that they want to take. So if people don't object, I'll take them in the order which they were taken in. Right. Firstly, I think it was so good to hear Sandy and Helen concentrate on what the effects in Britain. This is a disaster, and it's a disaster, incidentally, also for the Labour government. A situation in which billions of pounds are being given for a war in Ukraine, which can't be won, and where you're cutting off heating payments to pensioners is going to create an electoral disaster for the present government. It is, and even worse, Starmer followed up Trump's statements about not and Hesketh about not being in NATO by saying that there was an irreversible path to NATO membership for Ukraine. These policies are terrible and suicidal. Secondly, it's really inspiring and important to hear what Biljana said, because she's comes from a country where war is not a theoretical question, where there was a real war. So that gives you an indication of what's the real things in there. I think that a large part of the peace movement has been disorientated because it hasn't actually really studied the question in Ukraine. And it is absolutely true that ruling out NATO membership of the Ukraine is one key part. It's one of the two key pillars of bringing the war to an end. But the second is the situation of what was a binational state in Ukraine, which honestly now it could have been held together, was held together before 2014. There was no serious movement for splitting up Ukraine, and it was the policies pursued after the Maidan coup that bluntly have made the breakup of the state inevitable. And because you're suppressing the rights of a large part of the population, and the peace movement's got to understand that. So it's a big step forward about NATO, but I don't think there's going to be a quick resolution of the war, and the peace movement's going to understand the second question. And then the final point is that I am concerned that what Trump sees this is to make the situation better in Europe in order to pursue his aggressive policies in other parts of the world. So the situation remains dangerous. That's my take out. Why I thought it was a really fascinating discussion. Okay, Helen?
Thank you. I don't really have a lot of points of disagreement with what other people have said. It seems to me that the response of Europe to the American peace plans, however much distrustful one might be of them, is an indication of such a major rift within the NATO countries. And I think it has to be taken very, very seriously. And the looked for openings need to be grabbed by the peace movement insofar as they can. And it gives an opening for putting pressure on our governments to do so. Britain in particular is in a massive dilemma here. We've been looking towards the United States, been looking towards them for a trade deal, and here we are in direct opposition to them. So I think it's a major breach in the consensus in NATO. And while the distrust is clearly there, and Biljana is correct to stress it, and the way to peace is not at all clear, we have to be clear that there are possibilities there, and we need to take hold of them. I think one of the crucial problems with getting peace in Ukraine is the huge levels of distrust. And I think that distrust is particularly the case with Russia. They are not going to trust a ceasefire. They're not going to trust a ceasefire easily because it has been shown to be used to further arm Ukraine or whatever it might be. And therefore they're not going to agree to it. So it's sort of like off the table for the moment, except as a very last stage of all the various negotiations that may take place. And I think my final point is this. The situation in Britain is dire. I mean, people are not just dying of, it's not a choice now between heating and eating. You can't afford either of them. I just want to give a little anecdote of a friend of mine. There was a little old woman down her road who was admitted into hospital suffering from malnutrition and hypothermia. And I strongly suspect that sort of condition is not uncommon across Britain. And we have what we call a polycrisis in Britain. So many intractable problems. And within that, it means that we need to look at the alliances with not just the unions, and the unions have been adopting very difficult stands on a lot of issues. We need to look at adopting alliances with a host of what are often called single issue campaigns. There are a host of single issue campaigns across Britain, aware of what's going on, and we need to make that link. We have to make the link between the economic effects on Britain, the effects on Britain's situation and the war. And actually not just the Ukraine war, but all the wars going on around the world effectively.
Thanks very much, Helen. Right, Biljana.
I like to catch up to what Helen said and to add, I'm coming from a NATO country, which is the poorest country in Europe. And all this talk about making NATO more lethal, more deadliest, during this last few days by the US Defense Secretary, that means that on one hand, they want to wash their hands up from Ukraine and leave and to focus on probably China, while the Europeans, including my country, my poor co-citizens, we will have to pay for the mess that United States made. So we are there to clean up. Regarding the peace movement, the left movement, I fully agree that here we were caught in a dilemma. If we don't support the Ukrainians fighting for their country, it is like as if we did not support the Vietnamese fighting for the freedom of their country. I mean, there was a lot of talk and quarrels and misunderstandings. The narrative that was imposed by the West was dominant, and we were minority. Now I agree that even this little chance to talk about peace plan have to be used. We have to stress that this is class war, that this is a war of imperialism, and that the great leaders at the end of the day may shake their hands and drink champagne for some kind of peace deal, but the ordinary people are going to pay the price all over the Europe and probably in the United States. Thank you.
Okay, that's great, Helen. Right, Sandy, finally.
Yeah, I think we should be optimistic regards the populations in Britain's attitude to the war in Ukraine. I think there's a lot less support for sending weapons, sending money to Zelensky than there was initially. Initially, it was like almost a hysteria. You see Ukrainian flags everywhere. I would be out handing leaflets, as some of us were, against the war, and you get quite a hostile reception, even from the left. You don't get that now. We're out leafleting on Palestinian demos, and you get a favourable reception because people can see that what they were told about the war isn't the truth. Plus, there's a tremendous corruption in terms of the, 300 billion that the Americans give, and Zelensky says he only received 80 billion, and the rest of the money is suspicious. What's happened with it seems to have went to other organizations within America. So that's getting into popular consciousness. I mean, at first the propaganda was so strong, they were using the same terms: unprovoked war, full-scale invasion. Now you can see that they're kind of backing off a bit. And now with the Trump's intervention, it is very difficult for Starmer, etc. They're left out in a limb, really, you know. But at first it was really, in Scotland, we had the SNP government coming out and calling for a no-fly zone in Ukraine, which would basically, at the start of the war, would have meant World War III. You don't get anything like that anymore. Plus, although Trump's taken some positive steps in recognising reality and what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, you get these plans to take over Panama, take over Greenland, Canada, the 51st state, Gaza, take over Gaza. America and American imperialism is becoming a lot less popular, and there's much more feeling that that kind of the drive to war has to be resisted. It just doesn't have an organised form yet. And that's what we have to move towards. And the last point I'd make is this demand that Trump is making 5% spending on military affairs from all the NATO. I mean, that would be a tremendous attack on what remains of the welfare state. And it's unfortunate sections of people that used to be on the left, like Paul Mason, calling for more expenditure on weapons, more weapons for NATO. We have to, in the left, oppose that and say, look, what we really need to do is revitalise our economy, improve the standard of living of the population, because as it's been said, I think Helen said, it's really getting desperate for some people now in Britain. People that can't heat their houses and they can't live on the wages again. So I think we have to connect the two, the drive towards war and militarism, and we want to fight against that and fight against austerity and say, put the money in to developing Britain so it's a good place to live in, and oppose these military adventures that the British ruling class seem very keen on.
Right, thank you all. I thought it was a great discussion. For those who are watching, just to let you know that this podcast follows a discussion which took place in No Cold War Britain. The results of that can be seen on No Cold War Britain's X account, Twitter account, as it used to be known, at NCW Britain. But we'll put the links under the YouTube on this. So I hope you'll follow the discussion and look at the positions on this. And thank you very much to our speakers today. Thank you. Bye.